time for part 2 of my countdown of my top 10 personal favourite Marvel Legends Build-A-Figures. Now, I've got to say, this was really difficult. In fact, I didn't appreciate how difficult this list was going to be until I came to the second part, which is counting down from 5 to 1. Because there was quite a few entries here where I really had to debate hard with myself which character was going to get on my top 5. And it was tricky. It was really tricky. And I think that is just a testament to how great this line is and just how many fantastic Build-A-Figures we've had over the years. So starting off at number 5, we have Terrax. This figure will always have a special place in my heart because, believe it or not, there was a time when the future of the 6-inch Marvel Legend line looked to be in jeopardy. When Hasbro took over the license, they had a few initial waves launched, which were a mixed bag, I would say, in terms of quality and success. And the line actually dried up. They went to just a handful of special deluxe sets and then not very much at all. And it looked like the line may be dead because all the focus from Hasbro at the time was on the 3 3/4 inch scale, their Marvel Universe subline. And I remember how excited I was when the return of the 6-inch line was announced, and Terrax was the Build-A-Figure, the first Build-A-Figure in this new return. And obviously Hasbro really committed themselves to this line. They made a pretty fantastic first wave and it's only grown since then. But I was absolutely determined to make sure I got every single figure in this initial wave and made sure I built this Terrax figure because I've always loved Terrax. I think he's a really cool looking character. It's great to have another Herald of Galactus. At this point there weren't that many in the line. There was basically just the Silver Surfer. So an absolute fantastic addition, but the figure also stands very strong on its own merits. This is a fantastic sculpt. This was obviously wholly original at the time. There were no recycled pieces. He's at a very interesting scale because he's not quite a huge figure, but he's not undersized either. He's sort of in between, which is really very cool. And I really love the sculpting, the paint apps. I mean, if we look at the body here, we can see they haven't just gone for a base plastic mold for his arms or his legs. They've actually painted that in. There's a lovely paint wash running through this figure that gives it a great sense of texture and depth, which is fantastic. And I really like how they've used multiple layers on this figure to really add to that sense as well. So we can see obviously that his chest piece and the little skirt thing that he's got there are separate pieces that are built around this figure. They haven't been sculpted in, which is fantastic. It's all been carefully planned out in terms of the articulation so that none of this is compromising what you can do with the figure to get him into all those fantastic dynamic poses. And then of course he comes with this fantastic battle axe. Now the battle axe is admittedly lacking when it comes to the paint apps. It is just that base plastic there, but it is very nicely sculpted and pretty accurate to what we see in the comic books. So I think they've done a really nice job of this character, and up until this year he is finally getting a re-release. It's been a very long time since we've had any version of this character at all. So for a long time he was the only and definitive version of this particular character, and a very welcome one he was too. So I think he looks fantastic. He's a fantastic figure all round, and I'm just really glad to have him in the collection. Okay, so far in my list, they've all been Hasbro entries. Well, I didn't want to overlook the Toy Biz years at all because they produced, in my opinion, some of the very best Build-A-Figures, even to this day. And one of those entries has to be the Build-A-Figure Apocalypse. Now, we've had quite a number of Apocalypses in numerous scales in this line, and I think for the most part they've all been really solid entries, but this for me has to be the king. This is still to this day the best version of this character in my opinion. I just love the scope and scale of this Build-A-Figure. He's absolutely gigantic. He stands a good 14 inches tall. He's really super imposing, and I think this sculpt is absolutely magnificent. His proportions all over just look really solid, and this is how I tend to think of Apocalypse. He's a really solid, chunky, heavy figure too, so you can really feel that quality in this guy. And I think the articulation works really well, as you'd expect from a Marvel Legends figure, but it feels like nothing's compromised here at all. You can get him into so many different cool poses, and I love the fact that those big tubes that go over his arms and into his back there, they don't compromise the articulation at all. They work really well with the sculpt so that the tubes are long enough to be able to put him in various different positions, so he can have his hands lifted all the way in the air, but he can also have them down by his side without ever compromising the general aesthetic, the look of the figure. It always looks in proportion, it always looks really good. The paint apps are absolutely fantastic as well for the most part. There's some nice washes running over this figure to give it a real sense of depth and texture and detailing, which is wonderful. And the other really cool thing is I think this is the first time we actually had a variant builder figure in the line. So you could either opt for this black and blue version, as I have done here, because that's my personal preference. I think it just looks really cool. That contrast between the blue and the black just makes it look really stark and interesting. Or you could go for the all blue version. If we look at that, of course, we can see there's a really good paint wash running over that figure again to give it that texture, which is brilliant. But I love that you have the option to go for whichever version speaks to you as a fan, or indeed both if you want both versions of this character. So really cool that there's actually a running change, a variant to the builder figure. So very clever from Toy Biz's potential there to really maximize sales for this line, but an absolutely fantastic figure. I remember the first time I saw this figure fully assembled in my local comic book shop, and I was just immediately drawn to it, and I thought, wow, I've got to build this guy. Absolutely brilliant, really impressive, and I just love how he scales against the other figures in this line. He's so powerful and so dominating, and that's exactly how Apocalypse should be. And for number 3, we're back to Hasbro for the final Hasbro offering, in fact, and it is Fin Fang Foom. Now, I've got to be honest, there were so many other Hasbro choices that I was so tempted to put on this list, but as we got down to the final 3, I had to be very, very selective, and Fin Fang Foom, I think, has to be one of the greatest offerings from Hasbro. It's certainly one of the most ambitious builder figures to date. You had to buy 8 figures to build this guy. He is absolutely gigantic, but he's just so different to anything else that we see in the line. Now, Fin Fang Foom is a fan favourite. He's a really cool character, and not one that I ever expected to see in the Marvel Legends line. So delighted to have him. I think this is a really interesting sculpt. Of course, it is unique to this character. There are no other versions of this figure to date. This is a really cool one, and a very difficult one to get hold of. Sadly, I never built him myself. This is a really cool wave, though, and again, I think that actually is an added bonus to this particular builder figure, because I think the surrounding characters, although the quality is very different to what we'd expect to get these days, I do think there's a really interesting choice of characters here, such as Doc Samson. It's the only Doc Samson we've ever had in the line, but there's some really cool Hulk characters here. So if you're a Hulk fan, this is a brilliant line, and this builder figure is the icing on the cake, and I think this builder figure is brilliant. I think the sculpting is fantastic, the paint apps are brilliant, and they've managed to have a pretty good amount of articulation in there as well to make him a really fun, interesting, dynamic figure in the collection. So sadly, I don't have one that I can show you myself. I'm having to rely on these stock images that I found on the internet, but wow, it's something that's been long on my hit list, and I really, really hope that one day we get some kind of reissue, or perhaps even a HasLab version of this character, because I'd love to have this giant dragon in my collection. Okay, and back to Toy Biz, who are going to dominate the top 2 spots of my top 10 list. And at number 2, I have the Sentinel. And it's amazing to me to think that we've had several giant Sentinel figures in the Marvel Legends line, so he is not unique by any stretch of the imagination. We've had many subsequent Sentinels since this initial first builder figure, all the way back when Toy Biz held the license. And for the most part, they've all been pretty good releases, all the way up to, of course, including the HasLab release from a couple of years ago, which is pretty astonishing, and in terms of sheer scale, nothing really compares with it. It's obviously, in terms of the size, it is always going to be the champion, I suppose, of the Sentinel figures. But I think as a builder figure, this initial Sentinel figure is absolutely incredible, and for me, it's still probably the second best Sentinel ever produced, and it might even be my personal favourite. It depends really how you look at it. I think from a comic book look, it's got a very sort of generic look. It's not a specific kind of Sentinel by any one particular artist, so I think it can serve as any kind of Sentinel you want. I think there's that added incentive at the time that you could basically build a Sentinel army, because it was relatively affordable to buy multiple figures in this line if you could track down that crucial Spider-Man figure, that first appearance Spider-Man, which was very, very difficult to get hold of, and sadly is the one piece that has stopped me from building my own, which is why I'm relying on stock images here. I've got all the other pieces, I don't have that central one. But yeah, in theory, you could build an army of these Sentinels, and I know many fans did, and I think that is really attractive and really, really fun, and it wouldn't have cost too much at the time to have done that. I absolutely love the detailing and the sculpting on this figure. There's such a real sense of texture on the figure. It looks like it's a proper battle-hardened robot. It looks like there's all sorts of wires and bits and pieces, and a lot of that is down to the sculpt, but also, of course, the way they've painted this figure, the numerous different washes, different paints they've used. It looks gritty and dirty, it looks like it's seen some action, and it just aesthetically looks fantastic in the collection. Of course, it is quite tall. I think it might be one of the tallest in the line. He certainly level pegs with some of the other figures like Apocalypse, for example. I think it may be slightly smaller than the Giant Man figure from the Toy Biz line, but nevertheless, this Sentinel is imposing, and for the time, revolutionary. Like, it was so cool to have a Sentinel that was in scale with the 6-inch line of X-Men figures. This was so cool, and I really love those tentacles as well, that they thought to give them those bendy wire tentacles that come out of the palms, that could wrap up members of the X-Men. I thought that was a really cool extra touch and just fantastic. So I think all round this figure has fantastic articulation, it looks amazing, and it just scales beautifully with the other figures in this line, and to date it's still an absolutely fantastic one to have in the collection. And so we come at last to my top spot, my all-time number one, and it is Galactus. Now, this may not come as a surprise to some of you. For others, it might be hotly disputed. But yeah, for me, there could not be any other choice. This is my all-time favourite Builder figure. And funnily enough, it also happens to be the first. When this figure was first announced and this first wave hit the shelves, I was absolutely blown away. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't get my head around it. The fact that we were getting a Galactus in scale with the 6-inch line. Now, admittedly, he's a little bit shorter and smaller than perhaps he would be in terms of the comic book scaling, but hey, the ambition here was really cool, and it was revolutionary, of course. We owe the existence of every single Builder figure that we have in our collection to this first release, because if this hadn't worked, if fans hadn't gone for it, people hated this figure, then it probably wouldn't have continued. But the fact is, people went crazy to get hold of this figure. I myself went on a massive hunt to try and collect these pieces over years, and I was so happy when I finally did, and I was not disappointed. My word, this is an absolutely fantastic figure, and it's difficult to know where to start. Let's talk about the sculpting. The sculpting is brilliant. This is a very classic version of the character. It's a very comic book version of the character, which is brilliant. It definitely draws on the sort of the original Jack Kirby influences for sure. I really, really like how they've scaled the ears, and just generally the expression they've got on the face, and of course the paint apps that they've used really enhances all of this so that it looks really authentic to what we see on the page, but also really bright and colourful and interesting, just visually eye-catching. Like, it's just, there's no way you can ignore this figure, and a lot of that is down to the metallic paint that they've used, particularly in the blue areas of the body, and I just think it catches the light beautifully and it looks fantastic, and this colour combination works really well. So it manages to be really detailed and textured, but also colourful and bright and fun looking as he should be. Now, admittedly, this figure does highlight some of the shortcomings of the Builder figure approach, particularly when it comes to the consistent paint across parts, because as you can see, I've assembled my parts across numerous figures, some of them in better condition than others, and we can see that definitely there's a degradation in terms of the colours, most particularly around the skirt, and of course against the rest of the body. It's a lot brighter, it should be a consistent colour, and it's not. So that's a little bit distracting, and is obviously one of the weaknesses of this approach. But that said, that's a very minor gripe, because this figure is still absolutely fantastic. So sculpting, painting, brilliant. The articulation is wonderful too. It is, of course, the Marvel Legends standard, which is fantastic. So lots of points of articulation, meaning you can put him in many, many different action poses. So he's always going to look dramatic and fun in the collection or any display that you're going to put him in. And then you have the fact that he scales quite nicely with the other figures in the line, because he towers above them. Now, he's not the biggest or the tallest Builder figure that would ever be made, but for the time, this was groundbreaking and really, really impressive. So a much sought after figure, very, very cool one, and for me, not only the first, but probably the definitive Builder figure, because you couldn't pick a much cooler character to launch with and just get it so right right off the bat. Now, there have been other Galactuses released over the years, and most recently, of course, we have the HasLab Galactus, which I suspect will probably put this first release in the shade. Obviously, he's a lot bigger, he's got a lot more detail, he lights up, and he comes with some fantastic extra figures as well to boot. But for my money, I still actually prefer the look, the visual aesthetic of this particular costume on this first release, because this just makes me think much more of Galactus, how I think of him in my head. So for me, this is more comic book friendly, I suppose, than this later release, which is a bit more stylized. But hey, they're still obviously both fantastic. But for me, I think I'm always going to have a soft spot for this first release, because it really set the tone for what was to come. I think it's really ambitious, but so successful, and even now, I still think it looks pretty fantastic on display. So there you go, there's my personal top 10 Marvel Legends Build-A-Figures to date so far. This list may be updated in the future, maybe some of these positions might change, and maybe it's something I'll come back to, but there you have it, you've got all my choices there. What do you think? What are your personal favourites? What would have been on your top 10? Were there any that I missed that I should have maybe thought about putting on here? There were certainly a lot of candidates that I did struggle with. I've got a real soft spot for that Sauron figure from a few years back in the Deadpool wave, and I really thought I was going to put the Giant Man on here from Toy Biz, because that is such a cool figure. I think it's the tallest one that we've ever had, and wow, that took many different pieces to build, but sadly in the end I had to go for my own personal top 10. They just didn't quite make it, but what do you think? Please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.